Here is a question that sounds too simple to matter. What is a chair actually worth? Not what it costs at the shop, but what it is truly worth underneath that price tag. The man who spent decades trying to prove that gap was not an accident, but the central secret of the entire capitalist economy, was a broke, chain-smoking German philosopher living in a cramped flat in London, borrowing money from his friend Friedrich Engels just to keep the lights on. His name was Karl Marx, and the book he wrote, Does Capital, has been called the most influential work of economics ever written, and also the most argued about, banned, worshipped, and misunderstood book of the last 2 centuries. Today we start at page 1, not with revolution, not with the storming of palaces. Marx begins with something sitting in your kitchen right now, a commodity.
That already surprises people. You would expect a book that launched 100 revolutions to open with something explosive. Instead, he opens with, essentially, a coffee mug.
Exactly, and that choice is the whole method. If you want to understand a massive, complicated system, you do not start at the top with kings and stock markets. You start with its smallest cell and crack it open. For capitalism, that smallest cell is the commodity, every single thing that gets bought and sold. Look closely enough at one ordinary object, Marx says, and the entire logic of capitalism spills out.
So let us start where he starts. What actually is a commodity in his technical sense? Because in everyday language, we just mean a product.
Right, and Marx tightens that word considerably. A commodity is something produced specifically to be exchanged, rather than used directly by the person who made it. And every commodity has two faces stitched together, use value and exchange value. Use value is the actual usefulness of the thing. Bread satisfies hunger, a coat keeps you warm, a hammer drives a nail. It depends entirely on the physical properties of the object. Exchange value is stranger. It is the ratio at which one thing trades for another, 20 yards of linen for one coat, say, or a used bicycle for 80 currency units. A coat and a pile of linen and a bicycle and cash have almost nothing physically in common. One warms your back, one has wheels, one is numbers in a ledger. Yet the market sets them equal, as though underneath their obvious physical differences there is some common substance they all share, in different quantities.
And finding that common substance is basically the detective story of the whole first chapter.
It is exactly that. Marx rules out the physical properties one by one. It cannot be usefulness itself, because use values differ in kind. You cannot meaningfully say a coat is worth 3 loaves of bread in terms of warmth versus nutrition. So the common substance has to strip away all the particular qualities of the object. What is left, once you strip away the specific usefulness of a table or a coat, is that each is a product of human labor in the most general sense, effort and time spent transforming raw material into something useful. That, Marx argues, is the hidden common substance. Value, in his technical sense, is congealed human labor.
Let us ground that, because congealed labor is a phrase that can float away from people pretty fast. Give me an everyday version.
Think about a table, Marx's own running example throughout the chapter. A carpenter takes a plank of wood, cuts it, joins it, sands it, and out comes a table. The wood sitting in a forest has no exchange value, nobody worked it yet. What creates its worth is the labor time invested in transforming a tree into furniture, not the carpenter's specific skill or personality, but the average, socially necessary labor time it takes, given the technology of the era, to make that kind of table. Here is a sharper version. Imagine two people knitting scarves. One knits slowly with old needles, taking 10 hours per scarf. The other has practiced for years and uses better needles, taking 2 hours per scarf. Are the slow knitter's scarves worth 5 times more because she put 5 times the hours in?
Intuitively, you would think effort should count for something, but the market does not agree, does it?
No, and this is one of Marx's sharpest, most counterintuitive points. The market does not pay for your personal labor time. It pays for what he calls socially necessary labor time, the average time it takes a worker of average skill, with the technology generally available at that moment, to produce that item. If the slow knitter takes 5 times as long as the social average, she has not created 5 times the value, she has simply wasted her time. Her scarves sell for the same price as everyone else's, because value is set at the social, not the individual level.
That already has some brutal modern echoes. Anyone who has ever worked a piece rate job or freelanced knows this feeling. The market simply does not reward you extra for being slower, however hard you worked.
Precisely, and Marx is not moralizing yet in this early chapter. He is describing the mechanism coldly, almost clinically, like a chemist identifying a compound before telling you what the substance does. There is a second layer here that matters enormously. Marx distinguishes concrete labor from abstract labor. Concrete labor is the specific kind of work. Carpentry differs from tailoring, differs from farming, in actual physical activity and skill. Abstract labor is labor considered simply as an expenditure of human energy, muscle, nerve, and brain, stripped of its particular form. It is abstract labor that creates value, while concrete labor creates the particular use value.
Can you make that distinction physical for people? It is quite philosophical as stated.
Picture a construction site. A bricklayer and an electrician are both there, both spending 8 hours of their finite lives on that job. Concretely, their work looks nothing alike. One stacks bricks, one runs wires. But abstractly, from the point of view of the market that will sell the finished building, both contributed a quantity of generic human labor time, energy that could equally have gone into laying bricks elsewhere or wiring a different building. Capitalism, Marx says, is the first economic system that systematically treats labor this way, as an interchangeable, measurable quantity, rather than the specific craft of a specific person embedded in a community.
That is a genuinely historical claim, though, not just an economic one. Is it actually true that earlier societies did not think this way?
I want to resist flattening this into a simple story. Under European feudalism, a serf owed labor to a lord in a directly personal, unabstracted way, 3 days a week on the lord's fields, bound by custom and status, not a wage calculated in hours. Guild systems were similarly concrete. A master shoemaker's labor was not interchangeable with a master baker's. Each had its own guild, its own protected status, its own years-long apprenticeship. Labor only becomes commensurable, tradable through a common measure, once it starts to be bought and sold as a commodity itself, which takes off decisively with industrial capitalism from the 1700s onward in England.
So the enclosure movement becomes relevant here too, does it not? That is often cited as the hinge point.
It absolutely is, and it shows this was no natural, gradual evolution. It was often violent and legislated. From the 1500s and accelerating through the 17 and 1800s, common land that peasant families had used for generations was fenced off and converted into private property, frequently for sheep pasture to feed the wool trade. Parliament passed thousands of separate enclosure acts. Families with no legal claim left streamed into growing industrial towns, Manchester, Leeds, Birmingham, with the only thing left to sell being their own capacity to work. Marx calls this primitive accumulation and describes it as a violent historical precondition for the abstract labor market we now take for granted.
That is genuinely uncomfortable to sit with, because most of us just accept that of course you sell your labor by the hour. It feels natural, almost like weather.
And that feeling of naturalness is itself something Marx is trying to dismantle. Nothing about selling abstract hours of your life for a wage is natural in some eternal sense. It had to be created historically, often through dispossession, and then made to feel normal, invisible, obvious. We will come back to that heavily later in this episode, with what is probably the single most famous idea in this whole chapter, commodity fetishism. But we are still laying foundations.
Can we test this against something contemporary, though? How much of this survives into a modern gig economy world?
It is almost eerily direct, actually. Think about a rideshare driver today. What is being sold is not the specific charm of this driver, this conversation, this particular route. The app abstracts the labor into interchangeable units, minutes driven, miles covered, rated on a 5-point scale that flattens the driver into a number. Two drivers with entirely different lives become commensurable, comparable, exactly the way Marx describes abstract labor becoming comparable across a shoemaker and a baker. The pricing algorithm is, whether its engineers frame it this way or not, a machine for computing socially necessary labor time under real-time traffic conditions.
That is a slightly unsettling way to describe checking a ride price on your phone.
It should be a little unsettling. That is rather the point of doing this kind of analysis at all. Marx is not writing a dry economics textbook. He is trying to make the completely ordinary, completely invisible structures of daily economic life suddenly visible and strange again, so that we stop mistaking them for simple facts of nature.
So, to summarize before we go further, every commodity has a use value, its actual usefulness, and an exchange value, the ratio at which it trades. Underneath exchange value sits a common substance, abstract human labor, measured not by individual effort but by socially necessary labor time. And this way of thinking about labor as an abstract, sellable quantity is itself a historical product, not an eternal fact, arriving with the violent birth of capitalism in places like enclosure-era England.
Exactly right. And notice what we have not explained yet, how these values actually get expressed and measured in the real world through prices, through money. We have identified the substance of value but not its form. That is next, the value form, and eventually the strangest, most quoted idea in the entire book, why an ordinary object like a table starts to behave as though it has a mind and a will of its own the moment it enters the marketplace.
A table with a mind of its own. That sounds like folklore, not economics.
Marx uses almost exactly that comparison, dancing tables and all. Stay with us for part 2. Welcome back. Last time we cracked open the commodity and found two faces hiding inside it. Use value and exchange value. And underneath exchange value, we found a hidden substance, abstract human labor, measured in socially necessary labor time. But we left one enormous question hanging in the air. If value is really just congealed labor time, why does nobody walk around a shop with a stopwatch, checking how many hours went into a shirt before deciding whether to buy it?
That is the practical objection, is it not? Nobody actually calculates labor time at the checkout counter. We just look at a price tag.
Exactly, and this is where Marx moves from the substance of value to what he calls its form. Value has to show up somewhere visible, somewhere measurable in everyday life, or the whole theory would be useless. And the form value takes, ultimately, is price, expressed in money. But Marx insists on walking through this slowly, almost frame by frame, because he thinks the leap straight to money hides something important.
So walk us through it. Where does he start?
He starts with the simplest possible case, what he calls the simple or accidental form of value. Picture two commodities directly. 20 yards of linen is worth one coat. That is it. One thing expressed in terms of another single thing. Notice something odd here already. The linen is playing an active role. It is the thing whose value we are trying to express, while the coat is playing a passive role. It is simply the material that gets used as the mirror, the measuring stick. Marx calls these the relative form and the equivalent form. The linen cannot express its own value in its own terms. Saying 20 yards of linen is worth 20 yards of linen tells you nothing. It needs another commodity to reflect its value back at it, the way you need a mirror to see your own face.
That mirror image is a nice way to put it, but why does this deserve a whole stage of analysis? It seems almost trivial.
It seems trivial precisely because we are so used to the endpoint money that we forget this mirroring relationship had to be built up historically, piece by piece. Think about early bartering societies, cattle herding communities in ancient Mesopotamia, for instance, or various pastoral societies across history. If you have cattle and you want grain, you have to find someone who has grain and specifically wants cattle. That is called the double coincidence of wants, and it is a genuine practical headache. Simple barter like this, one commodity mirrored in one other commodity, works, but only clumsily, only when trading partners happen to want exactly what the other has.
So the next stage must be about solving that headache.
Precisely. Marx calls the next stage the expanded form of value. Instead of linen mirrored in just one other commodity, now imagine linen expressed against many commodities at once. 20 yards of linen equals 1 coat, or 10 pounds of tea, or 40 pounds of coffee, or 1/4 of wheat, or 2 ounces of gold. The linen owner now has more flexibility, more potential trading partners. But there is still a problem. This list is endless, and different traders are using different, overlapping, inconsistent chains of comparison. There is no single common measuring stick that everyone agrees on yet.
So, how does history actually solve that? Because this is where it stops being pure logic and becomes genuinely historical, does it not?
It absolutely does, and the history is wonderfully varied across different civilizations, which is worth dwelling on rather than rushing past. Marx calls the next stage the general form of value, where instead of many commodities all mirroring each other in a tangled web, society settles, usually gradually and through custom rather than decree, on one single commodity that everyone accepts as the universal mirror. Historically, this has actually been remarkably different things in different places. Cattle served this role in many ancient Indo-European societies, so much so that our very word capital descends from the Latin caput, meaning head, as in head of cattle, and the word pecuniary comes from pecus, meaning cattle as well. Cowrie shells served as a general equivalent across huge stretches of Africa, South Asia, and Oceania for centuries. Salt served this role in parts of ancient Rome. Soldiers were sometimes partly paid in salt, which is where our word salary actually comes from. Massive stone discs called rye stones served this purpose on the island of Yap in the Pacific, some of them too large to move at all. Ownership simply changed hands by communal agreement, while the stone itself sat in place.
That last one is remarkable, a currency that nobody physically carries around at all. It sounds almost like the modern idea of a shared ledger, honestly.
It really does anticipate that idea, and we should not be too quick to call it primitive. It worked perfectly well within its own community for a very long time. But eventually, across most large trading civilizations, one particular kind of commodity won out over the others almost everywhere, for very practical physical reasons. And that brings us to Marx's final stage, the money form.
And that winner was gold and silver, essentially.
In most large-scale trading civilizations, yes, precious metals. And it is worth actually explaining why, rather than treating it as an accident, because the reasons are almost embarrassingly physical. Gold does not rot, rust, or spoil the way grain or cattle can. It is easily divisible into smaller units without losing value. You cannot divide a cow in half and still have two functioning cows. It is portable. A small amount is worth a great deal, unlike bulky grain. And it is relatively scarce and hard to counterfeit or produce more of on a whim, unlike, say, seashells in a region where the shore is nearby. Once one commodity like gold becomes the universal equivalent that all other commodities are habitually measured against, you get money proper. And Marx's point, the point that is easy to miss, is that money is not something fundamentally different from a commodity. It is a commodity, gold or silver historically, that has been elevated by social custom into the specific social role of universal mirror for value.
That is actually a fairly radical claim if you sit with it. Money is not some separate, abstract, purely symbolic thing floating above the world of ordinary objects. It is itself just a commodity that got promoted to a very particular job.
Exactly, and this becomes enormously important later in the book, when Marx starts analyzing how money can seemingly transform into more money, capital reproducing itself, which is the entire second half of Does Capital's opening movement. But we are getting ahead of ourselves. For now, the crucial point is this. Price, the thing we see every day on a supermarket shelf, is simply the money form of value made visible. When you see a price tag reading a certain number of currency units, you are looking at the endpoint of this whole historical development we just walked through: cattle, cowrie shells, salt, stone discs, gold, and eventually paper and digital currency, all serving the same underlying social function, acting as the universal mirror that lets radically different commodities be compared and exchanged.
Let us bring this all the way into the present. Then, because paper money and digital money are obviously a huge further leap from a lump of gold you can bite to test its purity.
They are, and this is where the story gets genuinely fascinating rather than just historical trivia. Paper currency initially worked as a receipt, a claim ticket redeemable for a fixed weight of actual gold sitting in a vault somewhere. This was the gold standard, which most major economies operated under in various forms from the 1800s through much of the 20th century. But in 1971, the United States under President Richard Nixon severed the direct link between the dollar and gold entirely, an event now often called the Nixon shock. Since that point, the money most of the world uses is what economists call fiat currency, valuable purely because a government declares it legal tender, and because enough people collectively trust and accept it, not because it is redeemable for any underlying physical commodity at all.
So modern money floats almost entirely on trust and convention at that point, rather than on any physical backing whatsoever.
In a very real sense, yes, which sounds shockingly fragile when you say it plainly, and history shows us it genuinely can be fragile. Consider the Weimar Republic in Germany in the early 1920s, when hyperinflation became so severe that people reportedly needed wheelbarrows full of banknotes just to buy a loaf of bread, and workers were paid twice a day because prices could double within hours. Or consider Zimbabwe in the 2000s, when the government eventually printed a note with a face value of 100 trillion Zimbabwean dollars, and that note still could barely buy a handful of basic groceries by the time hyperinflation had run its course. These are not abstract textbook examples. They are vivid, terrifying demonstrations of what happens when the social trust underpinning the money form completely collapses.
And I imagine you are going to tell me cryptocurrency fits somewhere into this story too.
It fits in a genuinely interesting way, actually, and it is worth taking seriously rather than dismissing as pure hype either way. Bitcoin and similar cryptocurrencies represent an attempt to recreate something like the old scarcity logic of gold, a fixed, mathematically guaranteed supply that nobody can simply print more of at will, but without any physical commodity backing it at all, purely through cryptographic proof and a distributed public ledger that a decentralized network collectively maintains and verifies. In Marx's framework, this is a fascinating new twist, an attempt to build trust in scarcity through pure mathematics and decentralized social coordination, rather than through either a physical commodity like gold or a centralized government decree like a fiat dollar. Whether it actually succeeds at stably performing money's core social function over the long run is a live, genuinely contested question, and reasonable economists disagree sharply about it. But the underlying problem it is trying to solve, how do you create a trustworthy universal equivalent, is exactly the ancient problem Marx is describing in this chapter, just approached through an entirely new technological toolkit.
So, where does this leave us for the rest of the chapter? We have the substance of value, abstract labor, and now we have traced its form, all the way from simple barter to gold to fiat currency to cryptography.
Which sets up perfectly for the strangest turn in the whole chapter, and honestly, one of the most quoted passages in all of economic literature. Because once a commodity gets a price, once it enters this whole elaborate social system of mirrors we just walked through, something very peculiar starts happening to how people perceive it. The commodity starts to seem like it has value all on its own, intrinsically, magically, as though the table itself, sitting in your dining room, simply contains worth the way it contains wood. We start to forget entirely that this value was actually put there by human labor, by real people, in a specific historical process. Marx has a name for this strange trick of perception, and it might be the single most famous idea to come out of this entire book. He calls it commodity fetishism, and that is exactly where we are headed in part 3. Welcome back. We ended part 2 on a cliffhanger of sorts, a table that starts to seem magical. So let us actually earn that claim properly, because this next idea, commodity fetishism, is genuinely one of the strangest and most powerful ideas in the whole of Does Capital, and it gets misunderstood constantly, so we are going to build it carefully.
Start with the word itself, actually, because fetishism sounds like it belongs in anthropology, not economics.
That is exactly where Marx deliberately borrows it from. In 19th century anthropological writing, a fetish referred to an object, often carved from wood or stone, that a community treated as though it possessed its own independent spiritual power, its own agency, even though everyone involved knew, on some level, that human hands had carved and shaped that object in the first place. The power seems to live inside the object itself, rather than being understood as something people collectively project onto it through ritual and belief.
And Marx is saying something structurally similar happens with ordinary commodities under capitalism.
Precisely that. Here is the core move. Take a table again, Marx's own example. A carpenter, a real person with a real name, a real family, spends real hours of their one finite life cutting and shaping and sanding that wood. That labor, that specific human relationship between the carpenter and their material and their community, is what actually creates the table's value. But the moment that table enters the marketplace and gets a price tag, something strange happens to how we perceive it. The table appears to simply have value as an inherent property, the way it has weight or has a brown color. We stop seeing the carpenter's labor at all. We just see an object with a price, sitting there, as though the price were as natural and intrinsic to the table as its wood grain.
So the social relationship between the carpenter's labor and the eventual buyer gets hidden and replaced by what looks like a relationship between two objects instead, the table and the money.
That is Marx's exact phrase for it, and it deserves to be said plainly because it is the crux of the whole idea. Under commodity production, the social relations between people, the carpenter, the timber merchant, the buyer, all take the disguised appearance of relations between things, the table, the wood, the coins. We start to talk as though tables and money relate to each other directly. Table is worth so many currency units, as if that were simply a fact about the physical objects, rather than a frozen, hidden trace of a whole web of human labor and human relationships that produced them.
Marx has that wonderfully strange line, does he not, about tables standing on their heads and dancing.
He does, and it is worth pausing on because it is such a deliberately odd, almost comic image for such a serious economist to reach for. He describes how, the moment a table becomes a commodity, it transforms into something he calls a very strange thing, abounding in what he terms metaphysical subtleties and theological niceties, and he even jokes that it is as though the table, on its own initiative, began standing on its head and dancing, evolving whimsical ideas out of its own wooden brain, far more wonderful than if it had simply started dancing of its own accord as a piece of furniture. It is a genuinely funny, almost absurdist image, and Marx uses it precisely because he wants the reader to feel how bizarre this everyday phenomenon actually is once you really look at it, rather than simply accepting it as boringly normal.
Let us make this land with something completely contemporary, because I think a lot of listeners are already sensing where this goes with modern branded goods.
It goes there immediately, and honestly almost too easily. Think about a pair of sneakers with a famous logo stitched onto the side. The retail price might be 150 currency units or more. Almost none of that price, as extensive investigative journalism over the decades has repeatedly documented, reflects the wages paid to the actual garment workers, often young women in factories across Vietnam, Indonesia, or Bangladesh, who cut and stitched and assembled that shoe, frequently for a few currency units a day. When you look at the shoe on the shelf, you do not see her hands, her exhaustion, her long shift, her specific factory with its specific working conditions. You see a glowing logo, a story about athletic performance and aspiration, and a price tag that appears to simply belong to the object itself, an inherent property of the shoe, the way its color or its size is a property of the shoe.
That is the fetishism operating in real time. Then, the actual human relationship, factory worker to consumer, gets completely buried under the branding and the price.
Exactly, and Marx would say this is not some accidental byproduct of bad advertising. It is baked into how commodity exchange itself fundamentally works. Advertising simply intensifies and exploits a mystification that was already structurally present the moment production for exchange, rather than production for direct use, became the dominant way society organizes its economic life.
Let us push on the history here too, though, because I do not want this to sound like Marx thinks fetishism is some unique modern evil invented by capitalism out of nowhere. Surely earlier economic systems had their own forms of hidden or mystified labor.
That is a genuinely important complication, and it is worth taking seriously rather than smoothing over. Marx is careful, in fact, to argue that commodity fetishism is specifically tied to a society where production for market exchange has become the dominant, generalized form of economic life, rather than the exception. In a small self-sufficient peasant household, producing mostly for its own direct use, there is far less mystification, because the labor of each family member, plowing, spinning, cooking, is nakedly visible to everyone involved. It does not need to be translated through an anonymous market first. Similarly, feudal relationships of personal bondage and obligation were often brutally exploitative, but Marx argues they were at least transparent about their own domination. A serf knew exactly who their lord was and exactly what labor and produce were owed. There was no market mechanism obscuring that relationship behind a veil of prices. It is specifically the generalized market economy, where countless anonymous producers across the globe are indirectly linked to each other only through the impersonal medium of buying and selling commodities for money, that produces fetishism as a systematic, structural feature, rather than an occasional individual illusion.
So it is not that earlier societies were somehow more honest or virtuous. It is that a specific kind of concealment becomes structurally necessary once you get a fully generalized, global commodity market.
Precisely, and this connects to something genuinely happening right now in the world, worth bringing all the way into the present. Consider modern global supply chains for something like a smartphone. Cobalt mined under grim, well-documented conditions in the Democratic Republic of Congo, sometimes involving child labor that major manufacturers and human rights organizations alike have investigated and publicly acknowledged as an ongoing problem. Rare earth elements processed in facilities in China with serious documented environmental and labor consequences. Components assembled in enormous factory complexes in places like Shenzhen. All of that gets folded into a sleek, minimalist object that arrives at your door in elegant packaging, its price seemingly a simple, self-evident fact about how good the technology inside it is. The distance and complexity of the modern global supply chain does not create fetishism from scratch. It dramatically intensifies a mystification that was already built into commodity exchange from the very beginning, going all the way back to Marx's own example of the humble wooden table.
It is worth being fair to the other side of this conversation too, though, is it not? Plenty of serious economists would say this framing understates how much value branding and design and innovation genuinely add, separate from labor time.
That is a completely fair challenge, and an honest telling of this chapter has to include it. Mainstream marginalist economics, which has dominated the field since the late 1800s, largely rejects Marx's labor theory of value entirely, arguing that value is actually determined by subjective consumer preferences and marginal utility. How much satisfaction the next unit of a good provides a specific buyer, rather than by objective labor time embedded in production. Under that view, a cleverly designed, well-branded shoe genuinely can be worth more than an identical shoe without the branding, not because of mystification, but because design, reputation, and consumer trust are themselves real, legitimate sources of value that people rationally pay for. Marx obviously disagrees with this framework fundamentally, but it would be dishonest of us not to flag that this remains one of the most contested, actively debated fault lines in the entire history of economic thought, and reasonable, serious economists land on very different sides of it even today.
That is a good, honest place to leave that tension sitting, rather than pretending Marx simply won the argument outright.
Agreed, and it sets us up well for our final part, where we pull all these threads together: commodity, abstract labor, the value form, and now fetishism, and ask what all of this actually adds up to, both as a piece of 19th century economic theory and as a lens for looking at the world we are all living in right this moment. Welcome back. Before we move toward synthesis, there is one more layer of commodity fetishism worth digging into, because people often stop at the surface version, prices hide labor, and miss something Marx considers even more important. He is not simply saying people are tricked or gullible. He is making a stranger, more unsettling claim about the objective structure of the system itself.
What do you mean by that distinction exactly? Surely, if people misperceive something, that is just a form of being tricked.
Here is the crucial nuance. Marx is not arguing that individuals are simply too naive or uneducated to see through the illusion, as though a clever enough shopper could just think their way past it while browsing the shoe aisle. He is arguing that the illusion is objectively, structurally built into how a market economy actually functions, regardless of how smart or well-informed any individual participant happens to be. Even an economics professor who fully understands the labor theory of value, who can explain commodity fetishism perfectly in a lecture hall, still has to go out into the actual marketplace and treat prices as simply given facts, because that is genuinely how the coordination of a vast, anonymous, global economy operates in practice. You cannot personally trace the labor history of every apple, every shirt, every phone you purchase. Nobody can. The system requires this abstraction to function at the scale it operates at.
So it is less a personal failure of insight, and more like the operating logic of the whole machine, something built into the gears themselves, rather than into any individual's head.
Precisely, and that is why later thinkers in the Marxist tradition, particularly the Hungarian philosopher Georg Lukács writing in the early 1920s, took this idea and extended it into what he called reification, the process by which social relationships between people come to appear, and in a sense genuinely function, as though they were relationships between mere things, spreading far beyond just commodity prices into how people experience their own labor, their own time, even their own capacities, as though these were external objects to be bought, sold, and measured, rather than lived human activity.
Does reification stop at objects and prices, though, or does it start touching how people think about themselves too?
It reaches remarkably far into that territory, actually, and this is one of the more unsettling extensions of the idea. Think about how casually people today talk about personal branding, building your brand, treating your own personality, your online presence, even your sleep schedule and morning routine, as a kind of asset to be optimized and marketed. A job seeker is often coached to present themselves less as a specific person with a specific history, and more as a bundle of measurable, interchangeable competencies, a set of keywords matched against an algorithm scanning resumes. That is reification operating on the self, a living person increasingly experienced, by the market and sometimes by the person themselves, as a kind of commodity with a price, rather than as an irreducible human being with a name and a story.
Let us anchor that with something concrete from actual economic history too, because reification can drift into pure abstraction fast.
Good instinct, let us do exactly that. Consider the global diamond trade across the 20th century. For decades, the De Beers Company, through an extraordinarily successful and deliberate advertising campaign beginning in the 1930s and accelerating through the mid-20th century, managed to convince enormous portions of the world that a diamond engagement ring was simply, naturally, an essential, inherent expression of romantic love and lasting commitment, practically a law of nature. The price of these stones appeared, to nearly everyone buying them, to reflect their obvious natural rarity and beauty. In reality, diamonds are not nearly as geologically rare as the marketing implied. De Beers spent decades deliberately controlling global supply to keep prices artificially high, and a portion of the actual stones moving through the global market during periods like the civil wars in Sierra Leone and Angola in the 1990s were what came to be called blood diamonds, mined under horrific forced labor conditions, and used specifically to fund brutal armed conflicts. None of that violent, engineered history is visible in the glittering stone sitting in a velvet-lined box in a shop window. The stone simply appears to possess its own natural, timeless, romantic worth.
That is a genuinely powerful modern illustration, of exactly the mechanism we described with Marx's own wooden table example.
And it is worth being careful and fair here too, because the diamond industry has changed considerably since those darkest decades. Certification schemes like the Kimberley process were introduced specifically in response to the blood diamond scandals, and reasonable people can debate how effective those reforms have actually been in practice. That is a genuinely contested question among human rights researchers. But the deeper structural point Marx is making survives regardless of how any one particular industry reforms itself over time. The underlying mechanism of price obscuring labor and social relations is built into commodity exchange as such, not just into one particularly dramatic industry.
Let us also push this into the financial world, because I suspect fetishism gets even stranger once you leave physical objects behind entirely and move into stocks, bonds, and derivatives.
This is actually where Marx himself, later in Does Capital, pushes the concept to its most extreme and genuinely eerie form, what he calls fictitious capital. Once you have a fully developed financial system, you get instruments like company shares, government bonds, and eventually far more exotic derivatives that appear to generate money simply by existing, simply by being traded, seemingly detached entirely from any underlying production process or human labor whatsoever. A share of stock seems to have its own independent life, rising and falling in value based on traders' expectations, sentiment, and speculation, sometimes almost entirely disconnected from the actual underlying company's real productive activity.
The 2008 global financial crisis seems like an almost unavoidable modern example to reach for here.
It really is, and it fits with striking precision. Complex mortgage-backed securities and collateralized debt obligations were bought, sold, and repackaged repeatedly by investment banks worldwide, each transaction seemingly generating profit through pure financial maneuvering, while the actual underlying reality, millions of individual home mortgages, many issued recklessly to borrowers who could not realistically sustain the payments, grew increasingly disconnected from the soaring valuations of the exotic financial instruments built on top of them. When the underlying mortgages began defaulting in large numbers starting around 2007, the entire elaborate structure of fictitious, seemingly self-generating value collapsed with it, revealing rather brutally that all that apparent wealth had in the end always been resting on the real, concrete labor and real, concrete debts of actual working people paying actual mortgages on actual homes. Marx would say the financial crisis was a moment when the fetishized, mystified surface of capital cracked open, however briefly and however painfully, and the underlying human reality became suddenly, unavoidably visible again.
That is a genuinely sobering way to think about a crisis a lot of us lived through, or at least remember vividly from the news.
It is, and importantly, Marx is not writing this to induce despair or paralysis, whatever people sometimes assume about him from second-hand summaries. He is writing it because he believes that once you actually see the mechanism clearly, once the table stops looking magical and starts looking like exactly what it is, congealed human labor wearing a disguise, you are equipped to ask sharper, more honest questions about how the whole system might be organized differently. That diagnostic clarity, seeing through the fetish without pretending you can simply wish it away individually, is the entire payoff of this famously difficult opening chapter.
Which brings us, appropriately, to pulling everything together in our final part.
Exactly right, let us do that now. Welcome back for our final part on Chapter 1. Let us pull everything together, because we have covered a genuinely large amount of ground, and it deserves to be tied into a single clear picture before we close.
Let us actually walk it in order, the way Marx builds it, because I think the logic really does chain together step by step.
Let us do that. We started with the simplest possible observation that every commodity has two faces, a use value, its actual physical usefulness, and an exchange value, the ratio at which it trades against other commodities. We asked what could possibly make radically different objects, a coat, some linen, a bicycle comparable in quantity at all, And we found, following Marx, that the hidden common substance is abstract human labor, specifically socially necessary labor time, the average time it takes society at its current level of technology and skill to produce that item. Not your personal effort, the social average.
And then we asked how that hidden substance actually gets expressed and made visible in everyday life.
Which took us through the value form, from simple barter between two commodities, through the expanded form with many possible trading partners, through the general form where one commodity, cattle, salt, cowrie shells, stone discs, becomes the accepted universal mirror for a whole community, and finally to the money form, where precious metals and eventually paper and digital currency take over that role on a global scale. We saw that money is not something separate from the world of ordinary commodities. It is itself a commodity that history has elevated into a very specific social function.
And then, once value had a visible price attached to it, something strange happened to how people perceived commodities altogether.
That is commodity fetishism, the idea that once a table, a shoe, a diamond, a share of stock enters the marketplace and gets a price, we stop seeing the real human labor and real human relationships that actually produced it, and instead perceive the object as though it simply, naturally possesses value on its own, the way it possesses weight or color. The social relationship between people gets disguised as a relationship between things. And we saw, through the diamond trade, through the 2008 financial crisis, through the modern smartphone supply chain, through even how people market themselves for jobs today, that this is not some quaint 19th century curiosity. It is arguably more intense and more globally stretched out today than Marx could have imagined writing in a British museum reading room in the 1860s.
Let us be honest about the limits and controversies here too, though, because we have flagged a few along the way, and I do not want us to close as though Marx simply settled every question forever.
That is the right instinct, and it is worth being explicit about it rather than letting it fade quietly into the background. The labor theory of value that underlies this entire chapter has been seriously challenged by mainstream economics since the late 1800s, first by so-called marginalist economists like William Stanley Jevons and Karl Menger, who argued value comes from subjective consumer preferences and marginal utility rather than objective labor time. And this marginalist framework has been the dominant paradigm in most economics departments worldwide for well over a century now. There is also a long-running, genuinely difficult technical debate among economists, sometimes called the transformation problem, about whether Marx's own mathematics actually succeeds in converting labor values into real-world market prices consistently. A debate that serious Marxist and non-Marxist economists alike have argued over for more than 100 years, without full resolution.
So this is very much a live, contested body of theory, not a settled textbook fact, however influential it clearly remains.
Exactly, and that is precisely why Marx himself remains such a strange, dual figure in intellectual history. To some, he is a rigorous economist whose core insight about labor and mystification still cuts remarkably close to how modern global capitalism actually functions, supply chains and all. To others, he is a flawed 19th century theorist whose central value theory has been superseded by more mathematically elegant, empirically testable models. We think the honest position, and the position we will keep taking throughout this series, is that his descriptive, almost anthropological insight into how commodities disguise the human relationships behind them remains genuinely powerful and worth taking seriously, even for readers who ultimately reject his full technical apparatus of value.
So where does this leave a listener at the end of chapter 1? What should someone actually walk away holding on to?
I would put it simply like this. The next time you pick up an object, any object, a coffee mug, a phone, a pair of shoes, try to actually see through it for a moment, back to the hands that made it, the mine it was pulled from, the ship that carried it, the person standing at a machine for 8 or 10 or 12 hours to produce it. That act of seeing through the price tag to the human labor underneath it is, in miniature, the entire intellectual project of Does Capital. Marx spends the rest of the book, all 3 volumes of it, following that thread further, from the commodity into money, from money into capital, and from capital into the specific historical relationship between those who own the means of production and those who must sell their labor power to survive, which is where this whole analysis is ultimately headed.
And that relationship, buying and selling labor power itself as a commodity, is where Chapter 2 picks up, I take it.
Exactly right. We have spent this whole episode inside the commodity as an object sitting on a shelf. Next time, we follow Marx as he asks his next, genuinely unsettling question. What happens when a very particular commodity, the capacity to work itself, gets bought and sold on the market? And why Marx thinks that single transaction is the hidden engine underneath the entire capitalist system's ability to expand and grow.
A cliffhanger with real teeth, then.
That is rather the point. Thank you for staying with us through Chapter 1 of Does Capital. We will see you next time for Chapter 2.